Consciousness can be in two modes. It can either be aware of itself, be conscious of itself, or it can be conscious of all the objects or notions which arise within it. And whatever consciousness or awareness is aware of, it identifies with that. So it can identify with itself, in which case we say that it's realized itself, or it can identify with all its notions, in which case we often describe that as having forgotten itself. The Lord continued, by identification with its own object, consciousness seems to reduce itself to the state of thinking or worrying, even as impure gold looks like copper until it is purified when it shines like gold. By self-forgetfulness on the part of the infinite consciousness, the notion of the universe arises, but this unreality ceases when there is self-knowledge. So by identification with its own object, that simply means identification with everything which arises within consciousness, or with some of the notions that arise within consciousness. When consciousness becomes aware of itself within itself, the ego sense arises. So again we must be talking here about self-forgetfulness. With just a little movement though, this ego sense, which in truth is nothing other than consciousness, falls down as a rock rolls down the mountainside. In other words, it's got this tendency towards gathering momentum. It's like getting caught up in an addiction. You have a little bit and then a very powerful dynamic sets in whereby you want more and more, and then you're hooked. It's like any kind of addiction. Smoking cigarettes. It's best just not to start. But once started, it's very, very difficult to come off, to get out of it, to get out of that cycle. And this is the situation we're in with the ego sense. However, even then it is consciousness alone that is the reality in all forms and all experiences. The movement of the vital airs brings about vision within and an object which is apparently outside. So the vital airs here is obviously Prana. And here Prana is being invoked into a theory of perception. But the experiencing of sight, the seeing itself, is the pure supreme consciousness. There's only seeing going on. But we divide that seeing into one who is seeing, a seer, and an object of perception. But there's only seeing. And that is consciousness. The apparently inert vital air, which is the tactile sensation, comes into contact with its object, and there is a sense of touch. But the awareness of the tactile sensation is again pure consciousness. In the same way, it is the vital air, Prana, that enables the nose to smell the scents, which are modifications of the same energy, while the awareness of the smell is pure consciousness. If the mind is not associated with the sense of hearing, no hearing is possible. Again, it is pure consciousness that is the experience of hearing. And I think most of us have experienced that. You talk to somebody, but their mind is elsewhere. There's nothing wrong with their physical hearing, but the mind is not conscious of it. They might be in some fantasy somewhere. Action springs from thought. Thought is the function of the mind. Mind is conditioned consciousness, but consciousness is unconditioned. The universe is but a reflection in consciousness, like the scenery reflected in a crystal ball. We say that everything is reflected in consciousness, but we must be careful with following this analogy too far, because there isn't actually anything separate from consciousness to be reflected in it. Jiva is the vehicle of consciousness. So consciousness explores itself through the notion of a jiva, through an individual psyche. Egosense is the vehicle of jiva. So the jiva builds up its picture of itself through the egosense. Intelligence of egosense, the intelligence is brought into play by the ego to gather the necessary adornments. Mind is a vehicle of intelligence. Prana of the mind, the senses of prana, the body of the senses, and motion is the vehicle of the body. Such motion is karma. Because prana is the vehicle for the mind, where the prana takes it, the mind goes. So the prana here can be understood as the motivating factors, that which drives the attention all over the place. But when the mind is merged in the spiritual heart, prana does not move. And this is when mind realizes its true nature. And if the prana does not move, the mind attains a quiescent state. So we're getting this psychophysical theory in terms of prana, which I've discussed before. There's one strand of the Yoga Vasishta which thinks that pranayama is a way of reaching self-inquiry. But it's not self-inquiry. It can take you to a point where you can practice self-inquiry, but you don't need it. Where the prana goes, the mind follows it, even as the rider goes where the vehicle goes. So we can just understand this as the mind goes where the underlying tendencies take it, where our own psychological conditioning takes it. The reflection of consciousness within itself is known as Puryastaka. Puryastaka it means eightfold city. So we've got this eightfold categorization of mind and body. Mind alone is Puryastaka, though others have described it more elaborately, as composed of the 5 elements, the inner instrument, mind, buddhi, egosense and chitta, prana, the organs of action, the senses, ignorance, desire, and karma or action. It is also known as the linga sharira, the subtle body. Since all these arise in consciousness, exist in consciousness and dissolve in consciousness, that consciousness alone is the reality. In other words, these are all notions, and they can be quite fascinating notions. They've got absolutely nothing to do with self-inquiry. You do not need them for self-inquiry. So I tend to be very wary about getting involved in them. They do come up, and a lot of this stuff will be explored quite soon. But I would keep a certain distance from it. If you find it helpful, that's great, but the chances are it's just going to distract you from practicing self-inquiry. This subtle body, just one final point though, this subtle body, this linga sharira, is what apparently incarnates from one life to the next. It's the mind, the conditioned mind. But we need to be careful about getting lost in this kind of stuff. And the Yoga Vasishta helps us out by reminding us that all these are only notions. Notions which arise in consciousness. And we can realize consciousness as the sole reality.